Okay, I'm going to talk about post-structuralism today, and I'm going to talk about it in a sort of narrow way that I hope gets us prepared to talk about more specifics in class. I'm going to start with something that I hope either you understood in our last class that we had on Saussure or the last video that I made on Saussure, which is that signs can touch the world or point to the world or have real reference in the world. Post-structuralists, or at least early post-structuralists, disagreed with that claim. In other words, they, and here I mostly mean Derrida, argued that signs pointed only to other signs, and that when we wanted to claim that there was a referent or some way in which it did touch the world or point to a thing in the world, we were being disingenuous. Okay, so I'm going to show you how that works on my board that I love. Okay, so this looks a lot like it did in the last Saussure video I made, and you don't have to have seen that, but I just point out that we have 4 signs here, signifiers on the bottom, signifieds on the top. And according to Saussure, this sign would point to, touch, refer to this actual referent, this thing in the world. That if this said, if this said CAT, and this was my concept of a cat, it would actually, I'm going backwards, it would actually point to the cat. That's what it would mean. Would mean Lucy, my cat. Okay, would describe Lucy, my cat. Okay, that's Saussure. Post-structuralists, and again, specifically Derrida, talk about the ways in which signs refer only to other signs and never actually get down to the stuff down here. Okay, so let me explain how that works. If I'll use pink, if I say that this first signifier is for, that's not going to work, is for cat, then Saussure is going to say that this sign can point to Lucy as a referent, and Lucy instantiates the sign for cat. Derrida, post-structuralists, will point out that in order to understand cat, and I'm going to go through this really fast, it could take half an hour if we did it all together in class. In order to understand cat, I have to understand the sign concept signifier for animal. Okay, so I won't understand cat unless I understand animal, which means that these 2 signs are referring to each other. And specifically, he's going to say that signifieds become signifiers. But that's less important than thinking about the signs as referring to each other instead of to an actual cat. Okay, he's then going to say, in order to understand animal, I have to understand, in order to understand an animal in this sense, I have to understand human, maybe. Again, when I do this in class, when I have enough time to write on the chalkboard, like we go through feline and then mammal and then animal and then life and then something like that. Okay. But since we're short on time, I'm just walking us through this and saying that the next sign we need to understand is going to be human to differentiate us from the kind of animal that we mean when we say cat. Okay. And in order to understand human, we probably have to understand something that's not human, which for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to jump ahead and say eventually we get to something like God. Okay. So he's going to say, in order to understand cat, I have to understand what an animal is. And in order to understand what an animal is in the sense of cat, I have to understand what a human is. And in order to understand what a human is, I have to understand what a God is, which means I need to be able to find categories or signs that are different from or encompassing other signs, which also means that these signs touch each other. We end up with something like this. Again, we'll talk in class, but don't worry quite so much about why the signifieds go down to the signifiers. All you really need to know is that there's sort of a, that it's moving sideways. Now let me erase the screen, the chalkboard, hold on. Okay, so what Derrida says is that once we get some signifiers up here, we end up noticing that there are binaries, and that the binaries typically have one privileged term. So here, I don't think cat and animal are an interesting binary, but human and like non-human animal is maybe an interesting binary where human is privileged. God is privileged over human, and that's what this means. There's a binary and one of the terms is privileged. Okay, the other thing that's crucial for Derrida is that because all of these signs just refer to each other, it's not clear where we get to the real world. We need all of the signs in order to get to something that would be just true. And I'm gonna show you this. I used this example briefly the other day, but I'm gonna show you an example right now. Okay, so this, if it's showing up, is a page of a dictionary in Latvian. And someone once actually found a word that looked like a word that he knew in some other language, and it was maybe right, but let's pretend that it's not like any language that you maybe ever have learned, and it probably isn't. So notice if I gave you this page and told you here you can learn a little bit of Latvian, you would look at it for a while and say probably that you cannot learn a little bit of Latvian because you don't know enough Latvian to understand the definitions. And what Derrida is pointing out is that, for example, you can't learn this word without knowing what these words mean. I'm saying word, I should say sign. and that eventually, if you have a dictionary, the only way to learn anything from it is to understand the definitions or to understand other signs. This is one way of thinking about how signs point only to other signs, not to things in the world at this point. Another example is that if we think of the internet and I tell you, where does the internet start? You might say Google, but you would just be making that up. The internet, you can get anywhere in the internet from any other place in the internet, maybe unless you're in some closed system. And even then, that would be a fine example. But it's not like there's a page that has all the links or outlines the internet for you. You just dive in somewhere and then you move around from page to page. That's another analogy for thinking about the way signs work. Derrida points out that that can't actually be how language works, because otherwise it would never point to or touch or refer to anything in the world. That there has to be some signified somewhere that doesn't depend on other signifieds, that doesn't depend on going all the way through the dictionary and never finding any word that you know. That there has to be a word, a definition that you know in the dictionary. There has to be a page, well, there isn't one, so that's not a good example. But you have to know how to get online in order to find any of these pages. There has to be something that's working for you in order to make language work at all. And whatever that thing is, he calls the transcendental signified. The transcendental signified is the thing that stops all of the weaving around of all of the different signs, because you get to it and it just means something independent of other signs. So if you don't understand cat unless you understand animal, and you don't understand animal unless you understand human as opposed to animal, and you don't understand human unless you understand God, then you end up just saying maybe God is a transcendental signified, that you just know what it is. And so I've written that on here too, that God is a transcendental signified, which is another way of saying that we just posit, we just say, we just know that there is God. And that God is better than a human. Okay. Bressler points out that there are actually a lot of things throughout history that people have thought of as a transcendental signified. God, reason, origin, being, essence, truth, humanity, beginning, end, self. That as we move through different philosophical, ethical, intellectual movements, whatever we think of as the transcendental signified changes along with it. Okay. When we think of post-structuralism, we think of a way in which, so I'm leaving this very specific Derrida kind behind for just a second. When we think of post-structuralism, we think of a way of separating language from the real world and letting language function in a more playful and less rigid way that doesn't have to connect to very specific things in the world. It doesn't have to refer to something specific, but that can be malleable. Okay, this turns out to be really useful for a lot of later theories like feminist theories, queer theories, critical race theories, post-colonial theories, some kinds of psychoanalysis. And we're going to talk about those theories later in post-structuralist ways. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and hope that this is at least enough to get you through the chapter. All right,